See, whitewater rafting is dead now.
That's belong dead.
But as a sport. So they finally found a replacement project for
I think
the
it's really
Dock.
funny considering we only spoke about this last week.
Yeah, but about how it was dead. But now it's now going to be.
It looked like something off the
It's now
National
going to be
Lottery.
an open water swimming pool, or at least that's the proposal, with a name that we're not sure how to pronounce because we don't know whether it's Lido or Lido.
Apparently it's Lido. I don't know why they just don't call it a pool though.
Well, so Richard and I in the office today did both concede and admit to one another that we didn't know what a Lido was.
You thought it was a Lilo?
Yeah, I thought it was a flotation device.
We both thought it was.
Something very Love Island float around the pool on.
There's a touch of that. You will have people now asking to pull each other for a chat outside the whitewater swimming pool in George's Quay.
Why are we obsessed with outdoor water sports
in this country?
Like, it's
well up for this weather. Hello and you're very welcome to this week's episode of the Group Chat podcast from Virgin Media News. I am political correspondent Gavan Reilly, joined as ever by what were titled last week as the Mayhem correspondent.
I was the chaos correspondent.
Maybe not quite as much mayhem this week, but by news correspondent Zara King. Zara, hello.
Hello.
And Richard Chambers, hello.
Hey.
Quiet news week by comparison. Not quiet objectively,
because it's been quiet. There's still
a fair amount going on. But
yeah.
just by comparison to last week, like we're not here watching Sky News live, watching a rolling tot of ministerial resignations.
When I listened back to the episode last week, I was like, we are such nerds. Like, we were practically giddy. It was quite
I did
revealing.
Cringe a little bit at just how dramatic my gasp was when Boris Johnson sacked Michael Gove.
Yeah.
People at home listening going, why does that matter? Why does it care?
EastEnders drum snare finale is what it was, really.
It's been a busy enough news week anyway, largely because it's been that usual end of Dáil Term, let's shove everything through. Oh, and by the way, will the government collapse? A motion of no confidence in the Dáil, in the government tabled on Tuesday night, the government emerging fairly comfortably winners in the end, 85 votes to 66. Richard, surprised?
Nah. Lacklustre enough as a debate as well. I thought the whole thing was a bit lacklustre. Like, it's one of those things where, like, the vast majority of people don't see what happens in the Dáil anyway.
Yeah.
On a day like this, when there is an interest in, okay, well, there might be some threat to the government here, so you might potentially get more people viewing it than otherwise would. You do have to put your best foot forward as a performer. So what actually happens internally in political parties is they notice who gives a good speech. And I think that's what I was most interested in, because obviously from earlier on in the day and the days leading up to it, when you had all these conversations about what independents are voting to keep the government going.
And they were the ones who were actually salient. They were the ones who would decide whether the government was going to live or die in this.
Exactly. So they weren't really under a huge threat, although everybody's trying to do the mental arithmetic around this. But I was most interested in who was speaking, who gave a good speech and what it means for them going forward. I don't know if anybody stood out as a good contribution. And there was a few odd zingers in it. Like, I mean, there was Heather Humphreys was going on about codology of Sinn Féin.
Yeah, the flip-flop party.
The flip-flop party.
Heather Humphreys one is the one I would say that did the most reach in terms of what you saw on social media being shared by regular people as well.
I think it's actually, like, this is completely beside what we're going to be.
Outside the bubble, as we call it.
Yeah, but this is the point, is I actually think way beyond what we're actually talking about here is if you're looking at if she was ever interested in actually running for leader of Fine Gael, I genuinely don't think she's one of their better performers in the Dáil. She has this in her. It happens in election campaigns as well. So that's beside the point, but it's just an interesting one. Always look out for who gets to speak at these and whose speeches do well.
I've always thought that Paschal Donohoe is surprisingly good in that sort of environment because he never has notes either. That's not the first time that he has spoken in a confidence motion where things have maybe looked like they might be a bit stiff. And people have this idea of Paschal Donohoe as being very prudent, very reserved, a man who'll pour more over the spreadsheets than anything else. And he'll stand up and he will rouse the troops behind him in ways that actually a lot of people wouldn't expect.
I was just saying to you, you and I were talking on Thursday last week when the first kind of idea of this confidence motion had been mooted. I was with Reilly McDonald at a marking and sort of asking her, was it going to happen? And she was saying, we haven't made a decision yet. And I was like, but everyone's saying you're going to do it. And what happened there? Why was there so much confusion?
I was reporting that it was happening because the Dáil's business committee, which sets the agenda for the week, had been told it was happening.
And I put that to Reilly McDonald.
So I've been told, because Sinn Féin were then saying, we're thinking about it, we're considering it now that it's an official minority government, as we discussed on last week's podcast. Maybe it's best to put that to the test and see exactly what their command is. And true enough, then they told the business committee the following day, just so everyone knows, we're putting down a motion of no confidence, which then, because I got it confirmed from multiple people at the meeting, I reported as being a statement of fact. And then Mary Lou McDonald, kind of her face dropped when you put that idea to her.
She was really shocked. Yeah, I was like, was this notified to the Dáil Business Committee? And she sort of went, she was like, looking to her advisor, sort of going, no. You saw the
It
footage.
was. Sorry about that.
But Gavin, in terms of people saying that this was a waste of time, was it a waste of time? And if so, whose time was actually wasted?
It depends on what you think the goal actually was. I mean, if the goal was to kick out the government and cause a general election, which Sinn Féin have said on the face of it was the goal, then failure, and pretty poor failure, because it actually showed that the government is fairly united, has a few independents behind it, and that the opposition is not so united because the independents are still likely to flake towards the government from time to time. But was that the actual purpose of the whole thing? I'm not totally sure that it was, because so much of what Sinn Féin were saying between the motion being called or tabled and the vote actually taking place was, this is an opportunity for the independents to nail their colours to the mast and to show which side they're truly on. And it was actually the independents more so than the government who were in the firing line. It was pointing to independents in constituencies where Sinn Féin might have a hope of taking another seat next time. People like Peter Fitzpatrick in Louth, an independent TD in an area that Sinn Féin might make gains next time. They can now go to the electorate and say, well, is there much point of electing an independent like Peter Fitzpatrick if he was prepared to vote in favour of the old government to keep things the way that they were? So maybe actually they're playing a really long game. They're, even Leo Varadkar called them master tacticians in the Dáil on Tuesday night during the whole debate. Maybe that is what they were doing. They were trying to isolate people to make them vulnerable next time, because they knew that actually tabling a motion of no confidence wasn't going to collapse the government anyway.
That is definitely a byproduct of why you do things like this. I do think it's interesting, and some people I ask around politics about, like, what was the game plan here? Would it have been better to hang on till after the summer and come back when it comes around to crunch time for some of the cost of living stuff?
When less people are kind of away and maybe a bit more tuned into politics at that time as well.
Well, I think, no, just even from the impact of when things are actually going to bite when it comes down to cost of living stuff and the budget and stuff like that.
In those weeks leading,
things are going to be contentious. Yeah. And also, we'll probably come to this in a minute as well, but like things between the government parties may not be so rosy a little bit further down the line, where you can exploit some of that, that fractions or the fractious nature of things.
Well, you could argue that it was a little bit of a free hit, because the Dáil is rising. Today, the episode, the day this comes out is July the 14th. Dáil is rising and it's not back until September the 14th.
Happy holidays.
And then 2 weeks after that is the budget. So if you were to decide to wait until the other side of the term, there would be no need to table a motion of no confidence or confidence, because you would basically have a de facto one 2 weeks in when they have to vote on adopting whatever's in the budget anyway. So that's kind of a de facto motion of confidence. And then there's another one in December when you're supposed to rotate the job of Taoiseach, and they'll have to vote afresh on whether to give Leo Varadkar the job. So that's already a bit of a sign of whether you have confidence. So from that sense, it was a bit of a free hit. But as you say, like, relationships between the coalition, not necessarily brilliant, but maybe we might talk about some of the climate stuff in a couple of minutes. That would certainly be enough to sow some seeds among them.
Just in relation to the Dáil rising, just interesting for people who don't maybe understand, what does that actually mean in terms of where do the politicians go and what do they do? We always kind of talk about the Minister for August as journalists, don't we? There's always one minister who gets left behind to do all the interviews in August. But just for our listeners, Gavin, what does that mean exactly?
They sit home in front of the Virgin Media Player and they catch up on 6 weeks worth of Love Island that they've missed. What it means is that the Dáil doesn't meet. So there isn't question time where you can ask a minister what's going on in an oral thing. Nobody is bringing in a new law and you debate whether it's going to pass or not, or you debate whether it should be amended. None of that happens. Now, TDs will still tell you that they work there in their constituencies. They might take a week or two away, but that they're still around at home. They're just not required to schlep over to Kildare Street or make the big drive up or down to Dublin.
It's kind of a good time to catch your TD then if you have a particular issue.
Yeah, well, if they're still doing their constituency committees, they have a little bit more time on their hands, because they can't do that whole thing of, I'm taking a phone call now because I have to be on my way up to Dublin, because there's nothing to be up in Dublin for. There's the odd.
I know who they are who do that.
Yeah, that's it.
You know who you are.
We know
who you are as well. We're watching you.
Fake phone calls. We know they're fake phone calls.
Absolute. Sorry, we're going to hold on. The subject of that, the fake phone calls and politicians when you approach them in the street.
There are some cabinet ministers who are particularly good at taking the fake phone call just when they're passing the reporters on the way into cabinet.
Astonishing the amount of
I have known
ministers who take fake phone calls.
I've known one instance where someone did ring a minister when they were doing that and caused the minister's phone to ring aloud while they were on a phone call so that they couldn't speak to the journalists.
I've thought about it many times.
Yeah. I'll tell you who it was after we've gotten away.
I could probably guess.
People can guess. Yeah.
We mentioned
Maybe some of those phone calls are real though. We're open to the possibility.
To be fair, they're busy people. They have a lot to be talking about. The prospect of there being tension among the government parties. We have a little bit of that this week because there was supposed to be a move brought to Cabinet on Tuesday about banning the industrial sale of turf. Didn't happen on Tuesday, but may still happen at the end of the week. That is an obvious source of contention within and among the coalition parties. And then, of course, when they get back from the recess, Richard, it's budget time. And then really it's about who can haggle best. It's
the tough decisions. This is, there's been so many budgets which have come at difficult times in recent years, whether that be during COVID or you go back even to the times of the economic crisis and even the recovery, and you have to make tough decisions on what goes where and what can we do. And they do make or break governments. So the budget is going to be particularly hard because not everyone will be able to get something out of what the government has earmarked in that summary economic statement in terms of what they're going to spend the budget on and who's going to get tax cuts and all that sort of stuff. So that's going to be difficult. But as well as that, there's also the carbon budget effectively as well. The sectoral emissions targets. So this is basically setting out how much each sector of the economy and society needs to cut its emissions by. That has the potential to be the most contentious thing between the three coalition parties. It's the reason the Greens are in government. The Greens are in government to get Ireland's climate house in order. They're going to have a hell of a fight if they want to, because Eamon Ryan and the Greens want agriculture to do its maximum amount, which is to reduce by 30%. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil don't want that to happen. Because look, they're looking out for farmers. It's hard to do it. And they will dig their heels in. They have already said, we're not doing this, we're not going back in this. So there's a potential to fight on this. And if the Greens fold on that, what's
the point of having Greens?
So there's a lot of oohing and ahhing and looking forward to that. So if you're looking for the next big thing, crunch point for government and politics, that could be it.
And that was already a big thing, actually, even in the Dáil only this week. As we're recording this, the final week before recess, there have already been TDs from the rural areas, the rural independent group, standing up and saying the IFA say we cannot do any more than the 22%, which is the minimum amount we're expected to do. Any more than that, that is only just about tenable for the agriculture and food production sectors. Go any further than that, and they're basically not viable. The problem being, if you expect them to at least pull their equal share, they're already being asked to do less than everyone else because it's a carbon intensive area, but we all need food to live off. But asking them to do anything less than mid-20s or up to 30%, and then it becomes so much harder for every other sector. And should they all be made to push really hard just because agriculture is, pardon the pun, a sacred cow? And sorry,
I feel like as well, every time we have this conversation, I'm always so mindful of farm families that you meet, though, who will say, that farmers themselves at the heart of what they do are environmentalists. And I think sometimes it's really difficult because we speak to farmers a lot in our line of work, and I think they often feel sort of like they're misrepresented in this conversation, like as if they're in some way against, protecting the planet or following the climate agenda. They're certainly not. It's just that I suppose, like a lot of people, they would argue that they're also dealing with the basic cost of living increases across the board. And, that comes down to their farms or their businesses. And you mentioned their viability. The viability of those businesses really is on a cliff edge at the moment, no different to any other business. I think a lot of them would just feel, and I know from speaking to them, that, at the core, they are environmentalists and would sort of really argue that point when they feel like they're always sort of being pinned up there as being sort of against the climate agenda. Yeah, no, it's a reasonable point, and it's definitely one that's worth reflecting. Speaking of the Greens and climate, Catherine Martin's gotten herself into a little bit of trouble this week by it emerging that she's been taking quite a few business class flights. Obviously, she can't cycle to the Middle East to do all these tourism stuff and whatever she's doing. But business class travel is not considered to be the most environmentally kosher because of how few seats you can fit in business class relative to economy. And there's an argument that if she was consistent in her climate stance, she wouldn't be doing it.
Does that make sense, though, does it? Does that make actual sense? If you're going on a plane which has seats, some of them are in first class or business class, some of them are in...
And as in, the plane is moving moving and burning the fuel anyway. Is this what we're sort of getting at?
I get it.
There is that argument, but the argument is also that because...
as in the business class seats will be there whether they're empty or filled. Is that what the argument is?
That if you are distributing the carbon load between fewer passengers because there are few people in them, then each passenger contributes relatively more, is the argument. But it has kicked off another question, this classic question about should ministers be flying in business class? Should they always be flying economy? Should they be doing whatever is best value for the taxpayer? Or is there scope where they should be treated like ministers and that ministers should be entitled to take business class on long-haul flights? Should they be getting a government jet everywhere? A classic old tale as old as time. It may be controversial to admit this, but I've been told before. Here we go. Get myself cancelled now.
We had this conversation earlier on.
July 2022, I'm going to get cancelled. I have spoken to ministerial advisors in previous governments. Obviously, after 2010, 2011, it became just completely non-runner that you wouldn't take the government jet anywhere unless you couldn't fly commercial. And ministers were always expected to fly economy class. And I've travelled, or I've spoken with special advisors before who have travelled with ministers, and indeed to some politicians who have some experience of it as well, who say that with all the best will in the world, even if you travel in economy and you have an advisor beside you and you intend to maybe just have a little look over your notes, or you're going to Brussels and you need to revise whatever you're doing for that meeting.
So it's a working flight. You're working on board
that
the flight.
They don't feel like they can really work on that flight because there will be some civilian in a seat beside or in front of or behind them who knows who they are, who recognises them from seeing them on the news at 5:30 or the news at 7 or on social clips or whatever, and know who they are, and then want to have a bit of a gawk at the paperwork in front of them, to the effect that the minister and their advisor don't feel like they can actually open their own paperwork and therefore can't do the work on a plane that they anticipated being able to do. Now, that's a separate debate too, whether they should be allowed to travel in comfort if they're going to be working right up to a long-haul flight.
So you're saying it's less about comfort and more about GDPR?
Well, I think not even about GDPR, but just about the effectiveness of whether you can even, if a minister can't look at their own notes on a plane, then I don't know if we're sending them in the most
I'm just reminded of the course that we do every year, you know, with the little cartoon guy, and it's like, and it's like if you're on a train, like don't open your laptop on the train and all this kind of stuff.
Be careful not to allow anyone to look over your shoulder.
What do they call it? Is it?
I can't remember the
tailgating, I think they call it.
Yes,
it's tailgating. Yes.
Or when somebody comes into the building when you've got the thing open and they can then get access to all the sensitive stuff.
Yeah, but like that's a very legitimate concern, absolutely.
But is there an argument then for ministers flying business class long distance, or should they be expected to slum it?
I think the distance probably, we were talking about this earlier, the distance is probably a factor, do you reckon?
Richard is sitting there desperately trying to stay on the fence.
Yeah, but like I was kind of the same. I tried to stay on the fence earlier, but I couldn't actually argue with you when you made that point about, I suppose, state secrets or whatever, or like, you know, sensitive information.
You can imagine a situation where somebody is sitting in economy class as a minister or whatever and is going through notes, and somebody beside takes the phone out, snaps a photo of it. Oh, look at this. Look at this idiot here going through their notes on a plane. Everybody just jumps on it. Like, if that uproar would be something which you can foresee happening, well, then what's the best solution about like to prevent that from happening? So that's one way of looking at it. But have you, like, I mean, I do know some politicians and some ministers who do on the short haul stuff anyway, in particular. They do jump on economy and all that sort of stuff, and that does happen.
Yeah, I have been on short haul planes in the United States following a previous Taoiseach who there was no point in him remaining nameless because it's Enda Kenny. I have been on American tours with Enda Kenny when I was in a previous job working in radio, and you were better able to follow them around because you only needed your own kit. And I have watched Enda Kenny try to get a bit of peaceful shut-eye on a 2.5-3 hour flight, internal flight in America, and be continually disrupted by the drinks cart like ramming off his shoulder as he went up and down on the aisle seat while he was slumped trying to get a little bit of 40
minutes. Terrible, the poor man.
So, like,
that's why you book a window seat for sleeping. I always go for a window seat for a snooze.
People do think that like it is all, you know, champagne and truffles when ministers are flying abroad, but no, we have had situations where the head of the country has been woken up by a drinks cart ramming off his shoulder. So it's not all as glamorous.
You're never going to get a good snooze in the aisle seat though, just top tip.
One thing that the government isn't going to be able to do while it's on recess with its feet up watching Love Island on Virgin Media Player is do anything more about the cost of living, because if you can't legislate or you can't change tax rates or anything, if the Dáil isn't sitting, then you can't do anything about that. And that's particularly interesting, Zara, given that you today were talking to the Children's Rights Alliance about some of the issues that their clients are facing.
Yeah, so really interesting today. There was kind of two separate stories in relation to children today. One was in relation to the Children's Rights Alliance, who've published a report around child poverty, which I'll come to in a moment. And the separate one then was with childcare providers, talking about the fact that the ones who provide we debated this ECE or ECE scheme. We decided on ECE.
I've heard it being pronounced as ECE, but I think it depends on whether you think
so I said
you read it in Italian.
I said ECE at 5:30. It was kind of much for muchness. But the providers who provide that scheme, for example, are saying that they can't really afford to do this anymore because cost of living, their overheads have gone up, and they're saying now that they're going to be staging a number of flash closures basically in September. So parents won't be given the date. Basically, they'll turn up to the preschool and it'll be closed.
They won't be given the date.
They won't be given the date, and that's part of the whole premise of this, is that they won't be given the date, and it'll just be a case that you'll turn up and the preschool will be closed, and for 3 days in a row. That's the premise of it. And they feel like they obviously don't want to do this, but they're saying they feel like they have no other choice, and this is the only way they can send a strong signal to government in September, which clearly, as you know, is a couple of weeks out from the budget. So there's one aspect of it. Obviously, a huge factor in that is cost of living. But separately then, the Children's Rights Alliance publishing a report into child poverty today, really harrowing detail in that. Look, Tanya Ward, who's the chief executive of the Children's Rights Alliance, saying today that the government really needs to look at expanding the school meals programme out broader beyond just DEIS schools. And she makes an interesting point about the fact that we're now seeing a situation where we have middle income earners who are really struggling, and we've heard from many of them on the news.
Sure.
That they're two maybe working parents in the family and they still can't find a house to rent, or they can't afford to rent. Maybe they can't get a mortgage, or they can't get enough money to bid on a house to actually buy. So she's saying you're having a situation where you have middle income earners who are now essentially working poor, who are struggling to fill lunchboxes going to school every day. And she's saying that while the government last week announced that they were going to expand the school meals programme out to all of the DEIS schools in the country, Tanya Ward is saying today that really it just needs to be expanded out to all schools to ensure that children everywhere in Ireland are getting a hot meal in the middle of the day.
Half of all children living in poverty are actually not in DEIS schools. Half of all children living in poverty are actually in rural Ireland. So it's one of those things where you need to make sure it goes national to make sure that every child gets to benefit. And what we know is when it is part of the school day, children do better in school. They're more likely to return to school. They're less likely to miss school. And we know that it relieves the burden on parents, to be honest, because parents don't have to provide an extra meal in the school day.
I know that is actually something that the government has currently commissioned a report about whether it should be expanded, and that's only due back in September, which is just right up to the budget. So we'll see where that comes. We probably should mention all the psychodrama across the water, given that we spent a lot of last week's episode talking about the psychodrama across the water.
Once again, it's changing by the moment.
And all of us gasping as Michael Gove was sacked, and Wood Boris tried to hold on. And of course, 12 hours later, he had decided to let go because it was a futile exercise. And it's very difficult nearly to keep up with the runners and riders, because even Richard, even before you get to the runners and riders, you were tweeting earlier on about how the new Chancellor of the Exchequer had a 7 days that Craig David could only envy, given how busy he was.
The Craig David of the Conservative Party is Nadeem Zahawi. So
met this girl on Monday, took her for a drink on Tuesday.
Yeah, so on Tuesday appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. Wednesday he was out defending Boris Johnson. Thursday he was out saying Boris Johnson should go and that he must step aside. He'd been plotting all the way through to replace Boris Johnson. So he entered the race for the Tory leader, and then today he's out of the race for Tory leader. So, of course, 7 days, he's got a lot in there.
Yeah.
The roller coaster nature of politics. Somebody said something about it being a long time in politics now, but down to 6 now in the Tory leadership race. And a new frontrunner has emerged.
Yeah, this is Penny Mordaunt, PM for PM. Someone who's going to get elected on the basis of how snappy her podium is, basically.
She's going to get, I heard the best reason for why anybody should be the Prime Minister of a country earlier on today. Bob Stewart is a Tory MP, and he says he's backing Penny Mordaunt to become the new Prime Minister of Britain because of her bravery, right? So that's a good reason.
Okay.
Good reason.
Does she have a George's Cross, or what's she done then? What's her bravery?
He says she belly flopped a dive on the reality show Splash on ITV back in the day, which was described as a low point for television, the worst series to ever air on terrestrial television, and then came back and did another dive again. Seek out that dive. It was great. Good to watch back in the day.
I can't remember if we also broadcast that series here on Virgin Media Television. Maybe we did, which means
it sounds like
we might have that belly flop in our own archives. We'll work.
We have the rights to that then. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I can just hear our two producers being like, "Stop making promises."
So that's her bravery, was that she belly flopped on TV once and went and did it again.
Climbed that ladder.
Okay.
And dove again in front of Tom
And this
Daly.
is why she should be. Is that because, say for example, those photo calls of Boris Johnson in jumping out of planes and things like that perhaps we could get some great photo calls of Penny Mordaunt? Is that sort of the suggestion, that she could be just as buoyant and exciting as Boris Johnson?
Well, we'll hope she's buoyant if she's been doing.
She's a big Brexiteer anyway. She's a big
Fair.
Brexiteer. Don't expect anything to change. If she becomes, you don't expect anything to change with regards to Ireland and the North.
Will anything change as regards any of them? Because there is little reason, even though many Irish leaders are talking up the prospect that maybe this will be the Conservatives coming to their senses maybe and going back to the old hands across the divide way of doing stuff, particularly when it comes to Northern Ireland. There's very little evidence of that being possible at all.
It doesn't even feature in the debate. What's interesting is actually in the debate over who should be the next Prime Minister of all of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is the fact that it's been so centred on culture war issues. And like, we have a Taoiseach in this country, and whatever you say about him, what he said about the trans community a matter of weeks ago was that he doesn't want that sort of debate, which we've seen in the UK, to be imported to Ireland. And yet you see over in the United Kingdom where that seems to be the only issue separating a number of the candidates, or that seems to be the most focused on issue. And I think that's something to reflect on when we look at the politics of here versus the politics of there. And Penny Mordaunt, who's now obviously a front runner for this, she previously championed herself as this person who is an LGBT ally, and now she's trying to put the genie back in the box on the trans issue because clearly Tory voters look at this issue in a different way, which is interesting to see. She follows me on Twitter though, so if she becomes the Prime Minister,
get her on the group
we'll
chat.
get her on and we'll grill her about
the group chat.
Slide into her DMs.
I think you should get her on. We should get her on like next week before she becomes the PM, because it might be easier to get her. Put that bit in.
I want the Prime Ministerial
I want
guest.
to get that bit in. Get that done.
But it is it's an interesting one when you're looking at how politics is done there versus here.
It is quite bizarre that a country that has all the social ills and the poverty and the cost of living stuff that it's struggling with as well, that the major issue in the Conservative leadership could be the definition of what is a woman rather than how you're going to feed the country or deal with all those social ills. Yeah, we should give a shout out to Michelle Donnellan, who is the Education Secretary in Britain for all of about a day, and and has her portrait on the wall in the Department for Education. They made sure that her portrait is on the wall alongside all of the other Secretaries of State for Education that there's ever been, despite holding the job for about a quarter of a Scaramucci.
I love that for you,
which is
Michelle.
very impressive.
Love that for you.
Can't take that away from you, love.
No, love. Well done.
Moving from culture war to not hopefully actual war. Richard,
nice.
You've been doing a lot of work this week about the Defence Forces and some of the upskilling and uptooling and levelling up that's in
This
their
was
future.
an interesting piece you had out today. The footage was quite decent.
Yeah, I went to McKee Barracks at 0900 hours. I rendezvoused with our camera crew. And I went about finding out.
You're going to leave us for the army this week. You're obsessed.
Yeah, the army people have taken me in as one of their own now. So if I come in wearing a beret next week, that's the reason for that. Yeah. But no, this is about the future of the Defence Force. And we actually talked about this a number of weeks ago when they were talking about what we could do about this initially. So the Defence Forces needs to change. It's outdated. It's outmoded. We have the lowest spend on defence capabilities of anywhere in Europe. And it's been decided that everybody should be paid more in the Defence Forces because terms and conditions for people who work in the Army, the Navy or the Air Corps are all pretty poor in comparison.
That's a long time coming. And that's a long battle, yeah.
So they're changing that. They're also going to get new kit in, and they're going to buy radar so that we can actually look at what's happening in our own skies.
Now, when you say new kit, what are they getting in?
Helicopters, gear like that, more armoured vehicles, just better gear, upgrading barracks, all that stuff is well out of date. Most of our ships are unseaworthy at this point, so they're obviously going to have to be replaced. So it's an €8 billion spend over the next 6 years.
6 years.
It's a big spike in spending, so there's obviously been questions about whether or not it's appropriate in terms of, at a time when we're talking about the cost of living crisis. But what I think is actually most interesting about all of this is the cultural change which needs to happen in the Defence Forces and how much they're fronting up to how much they accept that there's a big problem there which needs to be done. People will remember the Women of Honour situation where women who served in the Defence Forces came forward with their own experiences and allegations of sexual assault, of bullying and harassment. It's been described as a patriarchal culture where women feel they won't have their grievances heard out. Also said to be a difficult place for minorities as well. And now the Defence Forces needs to boost its numbers. So actually the biggest thing they need to do is to hire 6,000 more people into the Defence Forces. 3,000 permanent, 3,000 reserves. The only way you're going to do that is by attracting more women to it. And they actually want to boost the number of women in the Defence Forces up to about 35% of total. So they need to make it a safer place for women. They have to drive out misogyny. Lieutenant General Sean Clancy, who's the head of the Defence Forces, like, look, zero tolerance for this. He's gone to every barracks in the country at this point. He's basically got this culture going where now everything has to be called out and just stamped out because, it's just an interesting situation where we find ourselves at the crossroads. And, the big question about how we defend our island and mark out our own sovereignty is the big issue, the bigger macro issue. But inside, there's a lot of change that needs to happen for that to actually even begin to make sense.
To have a crucial cultural change, though. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of the Women of Honour over the years, and they would talk about, even just the aspect of a kind of retrospectively looking back on times where women would have made complaints or maybe had spoken up about things wrongdoing that either they experienced or they witnessed, and then found themselves in a situation where they then didn't progress on their career, or they were kept or they were held back. And there's a lot of things like that still have to be addressed retrospectively. But certainly I think groups like that will welcome the idea of a cultural change and a cultural shift.
Something which is very much long overdue as well. But just one thing before we move on from that, people will sort of argue that investing so much in military hardware at a time when there's been a bit of a national debate around sovereignty or military neutrality and this whole question of, should we be joining an association like NATO? How's the government trying to square that? How is it trying to marry investing in a lot of hardware, including stuff that you could use to attack if necessary, and also not?
We're not invading Britain like Gav. Nobody's saying we're armed the tanks.
We don't know how the culture wars could become actual wars very quickly.
We're shipping out to Holyhead. No, but those debates around neutrality and allegiance are going to kick off because Ireland wants to be part of more EU defence missions, which opponents of that say that's the precursor to an EU army, which is obviously something we should have to have a big debate on. The best way the government has tried to frame it is basically, okay, this is better for our neutrality. If we're able to look out for ourselves, we won't need the RAF looking out for, here's what's happening in your airspace, because that's what's happened now.
So we are less compromised we would be less compromised if we can monitor our own international waters and airspace rather than needing to leech off Britain's capacity to do it.
Pretty much just getting the Brits to do it for us, yeah. So that's kind of the argument that they have there. I don't think that's going to satisfy everyone. I think there are some very legitimate grievances and concerns about this. And I do feel that oftentimes we've had this sort of, we've seen so many column inches and, when you hear debates in the Dáil, people say it's time for a mature debate on neutrality. And most of the people who say that say, well, we should just abandon neutrality. Which, I don't know if that's a meaningful or a mature debate.
We should have a mature abandonment of neutrality.
Yeah, exactly.
What they really mean.
But I think that's one to watch now. That's one to watch as things roll on.
So that's €8 billion over 6 years.
Yeah.
I just find the timeline really interesting. I'm like, given that we were talking about the Metrolink last week, I'm like, will this actually play out over the next 6 years?
How much will they actually be able to buy?
Yeah.
Would €8 billion buy you a good enough telescope for new iPhone wallpaper?
Richard Chambers is obsessed with
Let me look down the camera and I want people to see the excitement in my eyes. The Webb Space Telescope.
You haven't stopped going on about it.
You've not, I'm going to be honest with you, you've not stopped going on about this.
NASA TV.
This is the coolest and the most impressive thing in a world of absolute muck that has happened. We've had to look billions of light years away to find some beauty in this universe. And Webb did that and it brought home the bacon in style. So this is the most impressive and the most powerful telescope that's ever been created. It's currently 1 million miles away from us. It's pointing the other way. And it's scoping out stuff that doesn't exist anymore. It's showing up galaxies and stars which we've never seen before. It's basically unearthing the mysteries of how we all came to be.
You should explain for people who don't understand the basis of that sentence you just said. How is it showing us stuff that doesn't exist anymore?
And by people who don't understand, Gavan means me.
I didn't mean that, but okay.
No, it's fine. It is me.
It's a big telescope, right? And it's basically able to show how the universe was formed, okay? So basically, the way in space everything is measured in light years as a distance. That's how long it takes light to pass. So it takes 8 minutes from light from the sun to reach us on Earth. That's not a light year will tell you it takes it a year to do that. This is looking 13 billion light years away.
So the light that this telescope is seeing was emitted from something which existed 13 billion years ago and therefore probably does not exist anymore because all those stars have gone boom.
So you're currently looking at something which happened 13 billion years ago in the earliest days of our universe and time itself. And some of the most, everybody should check this out. They're going to be iPhone wallpapers for years. These unbelievable. Just like it's the most incredible, most humbling experience. Just look at some of this stuff of just how we were all created. Like everything, we can debate everything in this world apart from where life came from and how it all started. And this gives us the best scope about and helping scientists to understand all that. But it's also very pretty. So
it is quite pretty, and it's become memes already.
I actually saw people sharing it on Instagram stories this morning in the context of being like, girlos, forget about your problems, you're only a speck in the universe. Which
profound and beautiful.
It was quite profound and beautiful, yeah.
I mean, there's the famous pale blue dot speech, which tries to do that slightly more eloquently about it. It shows you the Earth and it's a little tiny pixel in the corner of a thing, and it's a speech by Carl Sagan, a famous astrophysicist, about how everyone who has ever lived and everyone who has ever died is on that pale blue dot. Every empire that has ever existed, every politician who will rise and fall, every war that's ever taken place, every religion that anyone has ever worshipped has all existed on that pale blue dot. And the Huns are like, girl, don't worry about it. Love that. I love how they've given it a 21st century spin.
Beautiful.
Brilliant.
No less profound or accurate, I would say.
Hopefully as well, they could at some point use that telescope to figure out whether points are actually legitimately scored in Croke Park as well, because that's been a whole hoo-ha.
Listen, if Webb can find out if there's clouds on distant planets millions and millions of miles away, Hawkeye can get it right for the All-Ireland
They want
final.
to be getting it right for Sunday, because if Hawkeye is not in play for the All-Ireland hurling final on Sunday, there will be words. Before we go, we probably should, given that it apparently has now become a routine part of the show that we talk about our opinions on Love Island, available to watch on the Virgin Media Player. And the departure in last night's episode at the time of recording of Jax O'Neill, who apparently has already showed back up at his old rugby league club to go in and say hello and think about maybe going back to training. But it does raise, Zara, the whole question of the mental health of participants in reality TV and some of the aftercare that there is, not even aftercare, in fact, mid-care, the care that is available to them while they're on the programme as well as afterwards.
Yeah, so we spoke about this today. I suppose obviously the situation with Love Island last night, where Jax was clearly very distressed by Adam Collard making a comeback to Love Island and sort of coming in and making a play for his not girlfriend, but the girl he was interested in, Paige. But I suppose the broader issue was around, I suppose we kind of said ourselves watching it was quite distressing to see how upset he was. And clearly, he was going through something and it was sort of unfolding maybe on national, international television even. So we had a look at Love Island's duty of care protocols, and interesting to see that in a statement they say that ahead of this series, contributors on the show will be offered video training and guidance covering inclusive language around disability, sexuality, race, ethnicity, behaviours and microaggressions. Now, I thought the microaggressions point was interesting. So they're given a lot of insight into kind of what to expect in the situation, and they're sort of being I suppose, schooled or trained in how to manage it. Also, crucially as well, they're offered comprehensive psychological support, training for all Islanders on the impacts of social media and handling of potential negativity, training for Islanders in terms of financial management. It goes on a proactive aftercare package, which extends support to all of the Islanders following their participation on the show. And we're told that they get around 8 therapy sessions minimum when they leave the show. But I suppose it was just, we kind of felt, I think, looking at it last night, that he was, clearly going through something in that moment.
I'll be honest that I was conflicted in watching it, because I had to watch it back because with the confidence vote and everything else, I was very late catching all up with it. And it was almost for a while like I thought there was a scene missing, because the transition between him getting aggressive at Adam, showing up and beginning to get close to Paige, more comfortable than he was happy with, and then suddenly the transition to him being a bit miserable and saying that he didn't feel himself and that he was thinking about leaving and then ultimately leaving. It seemed like the transition between them wasn't very well articulated. Now, to be fair, I can imagine that maybe if there have been some other signs along the way that he was having a rough time, that you wouldn't automatically air them, because if they weren't germane to any storytelling purpose, that there was no point in airing them, and that maybe then the show only has to address them on air when it's come to a tipping point and he's going to leave. I think we have to be careful as well. And look, we're mindful that there's someone who's having, who's clearly having a difficult time, somebody who has ADHD, so they already would find it difficult being in that kind of intense environment. You have to show them some sympathy and wish them the best in their departure, but also hold them accountable and not give them a free pass for some of the more toxic or aggressive behaviour.
The behaviour wasn't all right, Richard, was it? There were things that went on there that probably weren't all right.
No, there were, and this is a problem. This is actually, and like, I have no problem saying this, and I don't really care. And like, people probably think that we were advertising Love Island there all the amount of times we plugged it all the way over to the show. But this is about the time where I lose interest in Love Island every year, where there is a moment like this that comes where you see stuff which is a little bit too aggressive, or it's a little bit too close to the bone, or you see someone's mental health start to fray a little bit, and you're like, who is this for? What's happening here? I don't know if this is entertainment for me anymore. Do you know what I mean? With Jax, it seemed like he'd crossed the line a few times. There was a lot of aggression towards other Islanders. It was a bit over the top, sort of love bombing of Paige, I felt as well, which is a problem. Just very erratic, and I do feel like I felt like watching the episode where he left. It did feel like we'd seen a bit. Just a guy just completely collapsing in on himself in the middle of it, and for all of our amusement.
And it was very unfortunate as well that it does leave Paige then in that very awkward situation, because the natural assumption is, if he says, right, I'm now going outside to get my head in order and I'll be waiting for you when all of this is finished, it puts a big burden then on the other partner in the relationship, such as it is.
But she did not reciprocate at all in that moment. At no point did she say, great, yeah, I can't wait to see it. Like, I mean, I think it was very clear sort of from her behaviour, that she
Yeah.
definitely wasn't comfortable with some of what was said in that.
Well, we hope he gets whatever support is made available to him, and that it's adequate for whatever his needs are. And we wait to see exactly whether Paige says about that. The look ahead suggests that Paige and Adam may have a future.
May have a future. Before we go,
Yes.
I want to say thank you to Guy Sinnott from MCD, who is so lovely. And basically, Helen, who is a group chat listener, got in touch to say that her nephew Sean had tickets to the Westlife concert last Saturday, and they had their tickets, but they couldn't get access to the disability stand where they could go and have a better view and sort of, obviously get access to the space they needed to be in. And so very kindly, we contacted Guy Sinnott on behalf of the podcast, and he helped them out, and they had a great night on Saturday night. So thank you, Guy Sinnott. And thank you to Helen and Sean, and thank you for listening to the podcast. We're delighted to be able to help you.
And thank you for listening to the podcast as ever, because it's been a wild old week in news, and we were glad to be your chaperones through it all. We will be back, of course, next week as well. Don't forget to leave a rating on your preferred platform of choice and leave us a comment if that's something that you can do as well. Really big help and help to get the word out about the show. So we will wrap it up from here, and we'll thank you all very much for listening. Thank you, Richard Chambers.
See you after.
That's a Fade Street reference, which we will explain some other time. Thank you, Zara King.
Thank you, Gavan.
And thank you very much for watching. We will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.